Sarah Chin walked through the marble corridors of the Pentagon with her head held high, despite the whispers that followed in her wake. Her military boots, once pristine black leather, now bore the scars of countless missions overseas. The leather was cracked and faded, with visible tears along the sides that she had tried to mend with black tape. To most people passing by, they looked like the boots of someone who couldn't afford proper replacements. What they didn't know was that Sarah had specifically requested to keep these boots through 3 separate deployments. What they didn't see was the small, barely visible engraving hidden beneath layers of dust and were on the inner side of her left boot. What they couldn't understand was why a decorated intelligence officer would choose to wear such seemingly shabby footwear to one of the most important buildings in American defense. "Look at those boots," whispered Lieutenant Morrison to his colleague as Sarah passed their desk. "How does someone working at the Pentagon not have money for new shoes?" His voice carried just loud enough for Sarah to hear, though she pretended not to notice. This wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. Sarah had grown accustomed to the stares and comments over the past 6 months since her transfer to Washington. Her colleagues, most of whom had spent their careers behind desks in climate-controlled offices, couldn't understand why she insisted on wearing boots that looked like they belonged in a charity bin. They saw her quiet demeanor and simple appearance as signs of someone who didn't belong in their polished world of briefings and strategy meetings. The truth was far more complicated. Sarah had earned her position through 15 years of field work in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. She had crawled through desert caves in Afghanistan, navigated jungle warfare in South America, and spent months undercover in Eastern European cities where one wrong move meant death. Her boots had been with her through it all, and somewhere along the way, they had become more than just footwear. They were her anchor to the reality of what military service actually meant. As she entered the main briefing room for the morning intelligence update, Sarah could feel the familiar mixture of respect and disdain from her colleagues. They respected her record. It was impossible not to when someone had 3 bronze stars and a Purple Heart, but they couldn't reconcile her achievements with her appearance. In their world, success was measured by the shine of your shoes and the crispness of your uniform. Sarah's scuffed boots didn't fit their definition of a successful officer. "Agent Chun," nodded Colonel Williams as she took her usual seat near the back of the room. "I trust you have the updated intelligence reports from the Syrian border?" His tone was professional, but cool. Like many others, he had initially been skeptical of Sarah's assignment to his unit. A field operative with her background seemed out of place in their analytical environment. Sarah opened her worn leather briefcase and pulled out a thick folder of documents. Her analysis of recent terrorist movement patterns had been thorough and insightful, identifying potential threats that other analysts had missed. Despite her colleagues' opinions about her appearance, her work spoke for itself. She had prevented 3 potential security breaches in her short time at the Pentagon, though few people knew the details of her contributions. The briefing proceeded as usual, with various officers presenting updates on global security situations. Sarah listened carefully, occasionally making notes in her small notebook. She had learned long ago that the most valuable intelligence often came from connecting seemingly unrelated pieces of information. Her field experience had taught her to see patterns that desk analysts might miss. During a break in the presentations, she overheard Captain Rodriguez telling a story to a group of younger officers. "You know, when I was stationed in Germany, we had this one sergeant who insisted on wearing his grandfather's old combat boots from Vietnam. Command finally had to order him to get new ones because he was embarrassing the unit." Several officers laughed, and Sarah noticed a few glances in her direction. She understood their perspective, even if she disagreed with it. Military culture emphasized uniformity and presentation, and her boots clearly violated the unspoken standards of Pentagon fashion. But what they didn't realize was that her choice to wear these particular boots wasn't about money or stubbornness. It was about honoring a promise she had made under circumstances they couldn't imagine. The afternoon brought news of a developing situation in the Middle East that required immediate analysis. Sarah found herself assigned to a special task force that would work late into the evening preparing briefing materials for senior leadership. As the hours passed and the office gradually emptied, she remained focused on her computer screen, cross-referencing satellite images with human intelligence reports. "Still here, Chun?" asked Major Peterson as he prepared to leave for the day. You know, there are stores in the mall that stay open late if you need to pick up some new boots. His comment was meant to sound helpful, but Sarah could hear the underlying condescension. She simply nodded and continued working. By 10 o'clock, Sarah was alone in the office except for the security guards making their rounds. She had always preferred working in solitude, finding that the quiet helped her think more clearly. Tonight was no different as she pieced together a complex web of terrorist financing that other analysts had been unable to crack. As she worked, her mind occasionally wandered to the last conversation she had with her mentor, Colonel Marcus Webb, before he died in a bombing in Kandahar 3 years earlier. He had been the one to give her the boots, passing them down with instructions that she would understand their true significance when the time was right. At the time, she had thought he was simply being sentimental about an old pair of military boots. The engraving on the inside of the left boot was so small and worn that most people would never notice it. Even Sarah had overlooked it for months after Colonel Webb's death. It wasn't until she was cleaning the boots one evening that she discovered the tiny inscription, MW, Task Force Echo, 1991. The date meant nothing to her initially, but something about the careful way it had been etched into the leather suggested it was important. Her research into Colonel Webb's service record had revealed very little about 1991. That year appeared to be classified at a level far above her security clearance, with only vague references to special operations and classified deployment. Even with her intelligence background, she had been unable to learn more about what Colonel Webb had done during that time. What she did know was that Colonel Webb had specifically chosen her to inherit the boots. In his final letter, delivered to her after his death, he had written simply, "When the right person sees these boots, you'll understand why I insisted you keep them. Trust in the moment when it comes." At the time, the message had seemed like the rambling of a dying man trying to find meaning in old possessions. Now, sitting alone in the Pentagon at nearly midnight, Sarah wondered if that moment would ever come. The boots had brought her nothing but judgment and whispered comments from colleagues who couldn't see past their worn exterior. She had begun to question whether Colonel Webb's faith in their significance was misplaced, or whether she had somehow misunderstood his intentions. The security guard's footsteps echoed down the hallway as he made his midnight rounds. Sarah saved her work and began gathering her papers, knowing that tomorrow would bring another day of sideways glances and subtle comments about her choice of footwear. She had grown thick skin over the years, but the constant judgment from people who had never experienced real combat was beginning to wear on her patience. As she prepared to leave, Sarah took one last look at her boots in the fluorescent lighting of the empty office. The cracks in the leather caught the light, creating shadows that emphasized every flaw and imperfection. To anyone else, they looked like the boots of someone who couldn't afford better. But, to Sarah, they represented 15 years of service, countless miles walked in dangerous places, and a connection to a mentor whose wisdom she was still trying to understand. Little did she know that in less than 12 hours, those same boots would change her life forever, and the mystery of Colonel Webb's final message would finally be revealed in a way she never could have imagined. The morning brought unexpected news that would test Sarah's analytical skills in ways she hadn't anticipated. As she arrived at her desk with coffee in hand, Colonel Williams approached with an urgent expression that immediately put her on alert. Behind him walked a man she didn't recognize, wearing civilian clothes but carrying himself with the unmistakable bearing of senior military leadership. "Agent Chun, we have a situation that requires your immediate attention," Colonel Williams said, his voice carrying an unusual tension. "This is Director Harrison from the Defense Intelligence Agency. There's been a development overnight that needs your expertise in Middle Eastern terrorist networks." Director Harrison stepped forward, his eyes quickly taking in Sarah's appearance with the same subtle judgment she had grown accustomed to receiving. His gaze lingered momentarily on her boots before returning to her face. "Agent Chun, I've reviewed your recent analysis of the Syrian situation. Impressive work. We need someone with your field experience to help us understand a developing crisis." Sarah followed them into a secure briefing room she had never entered before. The walls were lined with monitors displaying satellite feeds, intelligence reports, and real-time communications from various global locations. Several other analysts were already present, their faces showing the strain of people who had been working through the night. At approximately 3 a.m. local time, Director Harrison began pulling up a satellite image on the main screen. Our monitoring stations detected unusual activity at a compound in northern Syria. Intelligence suggests this location has been used as a meeting point for high-level terrorist operatives planning operations against American interests. The image showed a remote desert compound consisting of several buildings surrounded by walls and guard towers. Sarah studied the layout carefully, noting the defensive positions and escape routes that would be available to anyone inside. Her field experience allowed her to see tactical details that purely analytical minds might miss. The situation became critical when we intercepted communications suggesting that a captured American journalist is being held at this location, Harrison continued. The journalist disappeared 3 weeks ago while investigating terrorist recruitment networks. We believe he may have uncovered information that could prevent a major attack on American soil. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she processed the implications. A hostage rescue mission in terrorist-controlled territory would require precise intelligence and careful planning. Any mistakes could result in the death of an innocent American and potentially compromise other operations in the region. The challenge, Harrison explained, is that we need to verify the intelligence before committing special forces to a rescue operation. The compound is heavily guarded, and approaching it carelessly could trigger the execution of the hostage. We need someone who understands both the tactical situation and the terrorist mindset to help us develop the right approach. As Sarah studied the satellite imagery and intelligence reports, she became aware of whispered conversations among the other analysts. Their comments weren't about the mission, but about her presence in such a high-level briefing. She caught fragments of their discussions. Why is she here instead of Thompson? And this seems above her pay grade. The doubt in their voices was nothing new, but it stung more sharply in this context. Here was a situation where an American life hung in the balance, and her colleagues were more concerned with protocol and hierarchy than with finding the best solution. Sarah had seen this dynamic before in field operations, where ego and politics sometimes interfered with mission success. Director Harrison seemed oblivious to the undercurrents of skepticism as he continued his briefing. We have a narrow window of opportunity. Intelligence suggests the terrorists are planning to move the journalist within the next 48 hours. If we lose track of his location, the rescue becomes exponentially more difficult. Sarah raised her hand, surprising some of the other analysts who clearly hadn't expected her to speak up so quickly. Sir, what do we know about the specific terrorist cell controlling this compound? Understanding their leadership structure and decision-making patterns could help us predict their response to different rescue scenarios. Her question demonstrated exactly the kind of thinking that had made her valuable in field operations. While others focused on the technical aspects of the mission, Sarah understood that successful operations required understanding the human element. Terrorists weren't just tactical problems to be solved. They were people with motivations, fears, and weaknesses that could be exploited. Excellent question, Harrison replied, his tone showing the first hint of genuine respect. Our intelligence indicates the compound is controlled by a cell led by someone calling himself Abu Rashid. We know very little about his background, but his communications suggest he's more sophisticated than typical field commanders. As Harrison spoke, Sarah's mind raced through her knowledge of terrorist networks in the region. The name Abu Rashid wasn't familiar, but the location of the compound and the described operational patterns reminded her of intelligence she had gathered during her last deployment to Syria. She began to see connections that others might miss. Sir, if I may, Sarah said, standing to approach the main display screen. The location of this compound corresponds to an area I monitored during my deployment 18 months ago. At that time, we identified unusual movement patterns suggesting the presence of a high-value target, but we were never able to confirm the identity. She pointed to several locations on the satellite image, explaining how the compound's position provided strategic advantages for someone coordinating regional terrorist activities. Her analysis demonstrated a level of understanding that came only from actually operating in similar environments, not just studying them from comfortable offices. The room gradually fell silent as the other analysts realized they were hearing insights they couldn't have developed themselves. Sarah's field experience allowed her to read the tactical situation in ways that pure intelligence analysis couldn't match. She understood how terrorists thought because she had spent years tracking them in their own territory. Furthermore, Sarah continued, her confidence growing as she warmed to the analysis. The timing of the journalist's capture suggests this might not be random. If Abu Rashid is as sophisticated as our intelligence indicates, he may have deliberately targeted someone whose investigation was getting close to sensitive information. Director Harrison nodded thoughtfully, clearly impressed by Sarah's rapid assessment of the situation. What would you recommend as our next step? Sarah studied the satellite imagery for several more moments before responding. We need more current intelligence about the compound's defensive arrangements and the number of hostiles inside. But, more importantly, we need to understand what information the journalist was investigating. If we can determine what he discovered, we might be able to predict how the terrorists will respond to different rescue scenarios. Her recommendation was logical and well-reasoned, but Sarah could see skepticism in some of the other analysts' faces. Major Stevens, a senior intelligence officer with 20 years of experience, cleared his throat disapprovingly. Agent Chun, with respect, hostage rescue operations require more than field intuition. We need concrete intelligence and proven tactical approaches, not speculation based on old deployment experiences. The comment was clearly intended to undermine Sarah's credibility, and she could see several other analysts nodding in agreement. This was the dynamic she had faced throughout her Pentagon assignment. Colleagues who respected her record in theory, but couldn't accept her authority in practice. They saw her worn boots and quiet demeanor as signs of someone who didn't belong in their world of strategic planning. Major Stevens raises valid concerns, Sarah replied calmly, refusing to let his skepticism derail her analysis. However, field experience provides insights that can't be gained from desk analysis alone. The terrorists holding this journalist aren't abstract tactical problems. They're people operating in an environment I know well, using patterns I've observed firsthand. Director Harrison held up a hand to prevent further argument. Agent Chen's field experience is exactly why she's here. Major Stevens, I appreciate your concerns about procedure, but we need all perspectives as we develop our response to this crisis. The tension in the room was palpable as Sarah returned to her seat. She had successfully defended her position, but she knew that her colleagues would be even more skeptical of her involvement going forward. In their minds, she had overstepped her bounds by challenging a senior officer's assessment. As the briefing continued with technical discussions of surveillance capabilities and special forces deployment options, Sarah found herself thinking about Colonel Webb's final letter. He had written about trusting in a moment when someone would see the true significance of the boots she wore. At the time, she had assumed he meant recognition of her field service or perhaps acknowledgement of her sacrifices for the mission. Now, sitting in a room full of people who judged her based on appearances rather than capabilities, she wondered if Colonel Webb had foreseen exactly this type of situation. Perhaps the moment he had written about wasn't about someone recognizing the boots themselves, but about her finding the courage to stand up for her own expertise despite others' prejudices. The meeting concluded with assignments for further intelligence gathering and analysis. Sarah was tasked with developing detailed assessments of likely terrorist responses to various rescue scenarios. It was important work that played to her strengths, but she could sense that some colleagues viewed her assignment as tokenism rather than recognition of her qualifications. As the room emptied, Director Harrison approached her with a serious expression. Agent Chun, I want you to know that your analysis today was exactly what we needed. Don't let the skeptics discourage you. Sometimes the most valuable perspectives come from people who've actually been where the action is happening. His words were encouraging, but Sarah knew that the real test would come when her analysis was put to use in developing the rescue plan. If her recommendations led to mission success, perhaps some of the skepticism would fade. If things went wrong, her worn boots would become symbols of everything her critics believed about her unsuitability for strategic planning roles. That afternoon, Sarah worked alone in her office, developing detailed scenarios for the rescue operation. Her analysis drew on years of field experience, combining tactical knowledge with psychological insights about terrorist behavior. She knew that somewhere in northern Syria, an American journalist was depending on the intelligence community to bring him home safely. For Sarah, that responsibility mattered more than any amount of workplace politics or professional skepticism. As evening approached, she prepared for another long night of analysis and planning. Tomorrow would bring new developments in the crisis, and Sarah was determined to ensure that her contributions would help bring the hostage home alive. She had no way of knowing that the next morning would bring a visitor whose recognition of her boots would change everything she thought she understood about her own story. The next morning brought an unexpected development that would change the entire trajectory of Sarah's involvement in the hostage crisis. As she reviewed overnight intelligence reports at her desk, Colonel Williams approached with an expression she had never seen before, a mixture of nervousness and barely contained excitement. "Agent Chun," he said quietly, "there's been a change in the command structure for this operation. We're expecting a very senior visitor this morning who specifically requested to review your analysis personally. I need you to be prepared to present your findings to the highest levels of military leadership." Before Sarah could ask for clarification, the office began buzzing with unusual activity. Security personnel swept through the corridors, and staff members who normally paid little attention to protocol suddenly became very concerned with the appearance of their workspaces. The energy in the building shifted to the heightened alertness that accompanied visits from the Pentagon's most senior leadership. At precisely 9 a.m., the elevator doors opened to reveal a small entourage of senior officers surrounding a figure that made everyone in the vicinity stand at immediate attention. General Patricia Morrison, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, walked into the intelligence division with the bearing of someone accustomed to commanding respect from the most powerful military leaders in the world. Sarah had seen General Morrison's photograph countless times in military publications and news reports, but experiencing her presence in person was entirely different. The general moved with quiet confidence, her eyes constantly scanning the environment with the awareness of someone who had spent decades making life and death decisions. Every officer in the division seemed to shrink slightly in her presence. "Where is Agent Chun?" General Morrison asked Colonel Williams, her voice carrying the authority of someone who expected immediate compliance with her requests. "I understand she has developed some interesting insights about our current situation in Syria." Sarah felt every eye in the office turn toward her as Colonel Williams gestured in her direction. She stood immediately, acutely aware of how her appearance must look to the most senior military officer in the country. Her worn boots seemed particularly shabby in contrast to the polished shoes of everyone around her, and she could sense the familiar mixture of embarrassment and defiance that had become her constant companion. General Morrison approached Sarah's desk with measured steps, her gaze taking in every detail of her workspace and appearance. Unlike the quick, judgmental glances Sarah had grown accustomed to, the general's examination seemed thorough and analytical, as if she were gathering intelligence rather than making superficial assessments. "Agent Chun," General Morrison said, extending her hand for a firm handshake, "I've read your analysis of the Syrian hostage situation. Your insights about terrorist operational patterns are exactly the kind of field-informed intelligence we need for this type of operation. I'd like to hear your recommendations directly." As Sarah began explaining her analysis, she became aware of something unexpected in General Morrison's demeanor. While other senior officers had listened to her briefings with barely concealed skepticism, the general's attention seemed genuine and focused. She asked pointed questions that demonstrated not just understanding of Sarah's recommendations, but appreciation for the field experience that informed them. "Your assessment of the compound's defensive arrangements suggests you've operated in similar environments," General Morrison observed. "Tell me about your experience with terrorist cells in that region of Syria." Sarah provided a detailed overview of her 18-month deployment, describing the challenges of gathering intelligence in areas controlled by hostile forces. As she spoke, she noticed that General Morrison's attention occasionally shifted to her boots, though not with the dismissive glances she had experienced from other officers. Instead, the general seemed to be studying them with a puzzled expression, as if trying to remember something important. "Agent Chun," the general said suddenly, interrupting Sarah's description of a particularly dangerous reconnaissance mission. "Those boots look familiar to me. They're not standard issue, are they?" The question caught Sarah off guard. In all her months of enduring comments and stares about her footwear, no one had ever asked about their origins with genuine curiosity rather than judgment. "No, ma'am," she replied carefully. "They were given to me by my former commanding officer, Colonel Marcus Webb, before his death in Afghanistan." At the mention of Colonel Webb's name, General Morrison's expression changed dramatically. The professional composure she had maintained throughout the briefing gave way to something that looked like shock, followed quickly by intense interest. She stared at Sarah's boots for several long moments, her mind clearly processing information that others in the room couldn't understand. Colonel Marcus Webb, General Morrison repeated slowly, as if testing the name. When did he give you those boots? And what did he tell you about them? Sarah sensed that something significant was happening, though she couldn't understand what. The entire room had gone silent, with every officer present clearly aware that they were witnessing something unusual, but unable to comprehend its importance. He gave them to me about 6 months before his death, Sarah explained. He said I should keep them and that someday I would understand their significance when the right person saw them. At the time, I thought he was just being sentimental about old military gear. General Morrison stepped closer, her attention now completely focused on the boots rather than the Syria briefing. Agent Chun, may I examine those boots more closely? Specifically, is there any kind of marking or engraving on them that Colonel Webb might have mentioned? The request was so unusual that Sarah wasn't sure how to respond. She had never shown the small engraving to anyone, partly because it seemed insignificant, and partly because she still didn't understand what it meant. But something in General Morrison's tone suggested that this wasn't a casual inquiry. There is a small engraving on the inside of the left boot, Sarah admitted. It says MW Task Force Echo, 1991. I tried to research what it meant, but that information appears to be classified above my security level. The effect of Sarah's words on General Morrison was immediate and profound. The general's professional demeanor cracked completely, replaced by an expression of amazement and something that looked almost like grief. She stood in silence for nearly a minute, staring at the boots with an intensity that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. Task Force Echo, General Morrison whispered, her voice barely audible. 1991, Marcus Webb. She looked up at Sarah with an expression that had transformed from professional interest to something approaching awe. Agent Chen, do you have any idea what you're wearing? Sarah shook her head, completely bewildered by the general's reaction. Around the room, her colleagues watched in fascination as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff seemed to lose her composure over a pair of old combat boots that they had all dismissed as embarrassing evidence of someone's financial limitations. General Morrison took a deep breath, clearly struggling to regain her professional bearing. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that made it clear she was about to reveal something of enormous significance. Agent Chun, those boots belong to one of the most classified operations in recent military history. Task Force Echo was a joint special operations unit that I commanded in 1991 during the Gulf War. Colonel Webb was my intelligence officer for that mission, and those boots. She paused, her voice catching slightly. Those boots walked through one of the most dangerous missions ever undertaken by American forces. The room remained silent as General Morrison continued, her eyes never leaving Sarah's boots. Task Force Echo was tasked with infiltrating an Iraqi chemical weapons facility to prevent Saddam Hussein from deploying nerve agents against coalition forces. It was a mission so sensitive that even today, most details remain classified at the highest levels. Sarah felt her understanding of everything begin to shift as General Morrison spoke. The boots she had been embarrassed about, that her colleagues had mocked, suddenly carried a significance she had never imagined. But she still didn't understand why Colonel Webb had chosen to pass them down to her, or why General Morrison seemed so emotionally affected by seeing them. The mission was successful, General Morrison continued, but it came at enormous cost. Of the 12 operators who entered that facility, only 4 came out alive. Colonel Webb was one of them. And those boots. She pointed directly at Sarah's feet. Those boots carried him through 12 hours of hell that prevented thousands of coalition casualties. The weight of the revelation settled over the room like a physical presence. Sarah's colleagues, who had spent months making subtle jokes about her appearance, now stared at her boots with expressions of stunned respect. The worn leather and cracked surfaces that had seemed like evidence of neglect suddenly appeared as badges of honor earned in service far beyond anything they had experienced. But General Morrison wasn't finished. She moved closer to Sarah, her voice dropping to a level that forced everyone to strain to hear. Agent Chun, there's something else about those boots that Colonel Webb obviously never told you. Something that makes his decision to pass them down to you even more significant than you realize." Sarah waited, sensing that whatever General Morrison was about to reveal would change her understanding not just of the boots, but of her own place in the military hierarchy that had often seemed to reject her. Around the room, senior officers who had questioned her qualifications now watched with fascination as their assumptions were systematically dismantled. "Those boots," General Morrison said, her voice filled with emotion she no longer tried to hide, "saved my life in that Iraqi facility. When an explosion trapped me under debris, Colonel Webb used those boots to kick through a wall that had collapsed, creating an escape route that allowed our team to extract me before the facility's security forces arrived." The general paused, clearly reliving a memory that remained vivid after 3 decades. "I told Colonel Webb that day that I would never forget what those boots represented: courage, sacrifice, and the willingness to risk everything for fellow soldiers. I never expected to see them again, and I certainly never expected to see them worn by someone whose analysis might save American lives in the same way that missions saved coalition forces 30 years ago." As General Morrison spoke, Sarah finally began to understand Colonel Webb's final letter. The moment he had written about wasn't just about someone recognizing the boots. It was about finding herself in a position where her own service and expertise would be valued by someone who understood what real sacrifice looked like. The boots weren't just a symbol of Colonel Webb's service. They were a bridge connecting her to a legacy of soldiers who had earned respect through action rather than appearance. But even as Sarah began to grasp the significance of what was happening, she could see that General Morrison had more to reveal. The general's expression suggested that the story of Task Force Echo was just the beginning of why these particular boots mattered, and why Colonel Webb had chosen Sarah to inherit them. General Morrison's revelation about Task Force Echo had left the entire room in stunned silence. But Sarah could sense that the general wasn't finished. There was something else in her expression, a mixture of respect and recognition that suggested the story went deeper than even the classified mission she had described. "Agent Chun," General Morrison continued, her voice now carrying the weight of someone about to share information that had remained buried for decades. "There's something else about Colonel Webb's decision to pass those boots to you that I need you to understand. Something that makes this moment even more significant than the historical connection to Task Force Echo." The general gestured toward a nearby conference room, clearly intending to continue the conversation away from the curious ears of the assembled staff. Sarah followed, acutely aware that every officer in the division was watching her with expressions that had completely transformed from mockery to amazement. The boots that had made her an object of ridicule were now the reason the chairman of the Joint Chiefs wanted to speak with her privately. Inside the conference room, General Morrison closed the door and activated the security protocols that would prevent their conversation from being overheard. When she turned back to Sarah, her expression carried a gravity that made it clear she was about to reveal information of the highest classification level. "After the Task Force Echo mission," General Morrison began, "Colonel Webb and I remained in contact throughout our careers. He often sent me intelligence reports and analysis that I found invaluable in my own advancement through the ranks. About 4 years ago, he contacted me with a specific request that seemed unusual at the time." Sarah listened intently, trying to understand how Colonel Webb's relationship with General Morrison connected to her own situation. She had known that Colonel Webb was well-respected in intelligence circles, but she had never realized the extent of his connections to senior leadership. "Colonel Webb asked me to keep watch for a particular type of intelligence officer," General Morrison continued. "Someone with extensive field experience who had demonstrated exceptional analytical capabilities, but who might be overlooked by traditional promotion pathways. He was very specific about the qualities he wanted me to watch for." The general paused, her eyes focusing directly on Sarah with an intensity that made clear she was about to reveal something of personal significance. "He described someone who had earned respect through service rather than politics, who understood both tactical operations and strategic thinking, and who had the courage to maintain their principles even when facing skepticism from colleagues who had never experienced real combat." Sarah felt a chill of recognition as she realized that General Morrison was describing her own career path with uncanny accuracy. The combination of field service, analytical work, and professional challenges she had faced seemed too specific to be coincidental. When Colonel Webb died, General Morrison continued, I assumed his request was simply the concern of a mentor trying to help promising officers advance their careers. It wasn't until I read your analysis of the Syrian hostage situation that I realized he had someone specific in mind, someone he had been preparing for exactly this type of moment. The implication of what General Morrison was suggesting began to dawn on Sarah. Colonel Webb hadn't just given her the boots as a memento of his service. He had been positioning her for an opportunity that he knew would eventually arise. His final letter about trusting in the right moment suddenly took on an entirely different meaning. Agent Chun, General Morrison said, her voice becoming formal in a way that indicated she was about to make an official statement. Based on your analysis of the current hostage situation and your demonstrated expertise in Middle Eastern operations, I am assigning you as the primary intelligence coordinator for the rescue mission. You will work directly with Special Forces commanders to develop the operational plan. The promotion was so sudden and significant that Sarah struggled to process its implications. She had gone from being a marginalized analyst whose appearance was mocked by colleagues to being personally selected by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs for one of the most sensitive missions currently under consideration. But General Morrison wasn't finished. Furthermore, I am recommending you for immediate promotion to Lieutenant Colonel and assignment as the Pentagon's senior analyst for Middle Eastern terrorist networks. Your field experience combined with your analytical capabilities makes you exactly the type of officer we need in senior intelligence positions. Sarah stared at General Morrison in amazement, unable to fully comprehend how quickly her professional situation had transformed. The boots that had been symbols of her outsider status were now the reason for her elevation to responsibilities she had never dreamed of achieving. Ma'am, Sarah said carefully, I'm honored by your confidence, but I have to ask, why did Colonel Webb specifically prepare me for this moment? What did he see in my service that made him think I would be ready for these responsibilities? General Morrison smiled for the first time since entering the conference room, her expression showing genuine warmth rather than just professional respect. Colonel Webb told me that during your deployment together in Syria, you prevented a terrorist attack on a refugee camp by correctly analyzing intelligence that other officers had dismissed as unreliable. When he pressed you for details about how you had reached your conclusions, you told him that your combat boots had walked through enough refugee camps that you understood how terrorists thought about targeting civilians. The memory came flooding back to Sarah. She had indeed made that comment to Colonel Webb, though she had thought of it as an offhand remark rather than a profound insight. At the time, she had been frustrated by colleagues who analyzed terrorist threats without understanding the human reality of the situations they were studying. That comment convinced Colonel Webb that you understood something essential about intelligence work that can't be taught in classrooms or learned from computer screens, General Morrison explained. You understood that effective intelligence requires walking in the same places where the threats develop, understanding the environment where decisions are made, and maintaining connection to the human cost of the conflicts we study. As General Morrison spoke, Sarah finally understood why Colonel Webb had been so insistent about her keeping the boots. They weren't just symbols of his service or even connections to classified missions. They represented a philosophy about intelligence work that valued field experience and human understanding over theoretical knowledge and political connections. The terrorist cell holding the American journalist, General Morrison continued, is operating in an environment you know well, using tactics you have observed firsthand. Your analysis has already identified patterns that our desk analysts missed. Colonel Webb knew that someday we would face exactly this type of situation, and he wanted to ensure that someone with your background would be in position to help solve it. The weight of responsibility settled on Sarah as she realized that an American life might depend on her ability to correctly assess the terrorist threat and develop an effective rescue plan. But for the first time since her assignment to the Pentagon, she felt truly qualified for the challenges ahead. Her field experience, which had often seemed like a liability in the world of strategic planning, was now exactly what the mission required. Over the following weeks, Sarah worked closely with Special Forces commanders to develop a detailed rescue plan for the captured journalist. Her analysis of terrorist behavior patterns, informed by years of field observation, proved crucial in predicting how the hostage-takers would respond to different scenarios. The mission was ultimately successful, with the journalist rescued safely and valuable intelligence gathered about terrorist networks throughout the region. The success of the rescue operation transformed Sarah's status within the Pentagon intelligence community. Officers who had previously questioned her qualifications now sought her input on challenging analytical problems. Her worn boots, once symbols of her outsider status, became conversation starters that allowed her to share insights from her field experience with colleagues who had never left Washington. But perhaps the most significant change was in Sarah's own understanding of her career trajectory. She realized that Colonel Webb had seen qualities in her service that she had never fully appreciated herself. His gift of the boots hadn't just been about honoring the past. It had been about preparing her to contribute to future missions where her unique combination of field experience and analytical capabilities would be essential. 6 months after the Syrian rescue mission, Sarah received her promotion to lieutenant colonel and took on her new responsibilities as the Pentagon's senior analyst for Middle Eastern operations. On her first day in the new position, she made a point of wearing the same boots that had carried her through the transformation from marginalized analyst to senior intelligence officer. As she walked through the Pentagon corridors, Sarah noticed that the whispers that followed her had completely changed. Instead of mockery about her appearance, she heard comments about her successful mission leadership and her valuable field experience. The boots that had once marked her as an outsider were now recognized as symbols of the kind of hands-on service that the intelligence community needed more of. In her new office, Sarah kept a framed copy of Colonel Webb's final letter on her desk as a reminder of the moment when someone would recognize the true significance of the boots she wore. That moment had come in a way she never could have anticipated, leading to opportunities that validated everything Colonel Webb had seen in her potential. The boots themselves remained unchanged, still worn, still cracked, still bearing the scars of countless missions in dangerous places. But their meaning had been transformed completely. They were no longer symbols of someone who couldn't afford better footwear. They were badges of honor worn by someone whose service had earned recognition from the highest levels of military leadership. Most importantly, Sarah had learned that Colonel Webb's final message wasn't just about waiting for recognition from others. It was about understanding that her field experience, her analytical capabilities, and her commitment to the human dimension of intelligence work were exactly the qualifications needed for the most challenging missions. The boots had always carried that significance. She had simply needed to find herself in a position where their value could be fully appreciated. Years later, when Sarah reached the rank of general herself, she would pass down those same boots to another field-experienced officer who seemed overlooked by traditional promotion pathways. Along with them, she would include her own letter about trusting in the moment when the right person would recognize their significance, ensuring that Colonel Webb's legacy of valuing substance over appearance would continue to influence future generations of intelligence officers.